I'm Leanne Tran, psychologist who's worked with families whose kids don't fit the mould for almost 20 years. I've worked with children for decades, but I know parents are the real change makers when it comes to their kids. Having 3 kids of my own means I know it's not easy. Parent Like a Psychologist is all about simplifying how you support your kids with psychology information filtered through years of experience to take you from overwhelmed to confident. Come on in.
Hi, thanks so much for joining me on another episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. I'm talking today about autism in girls. I've talked a bit in the past about ADHD in girls and how that's different, and autism is the same. So hopefully this will give you some ideas about understanding what the differences are, the impact that that has on girls, because it changes things like identification or diagnosis rates, and then also some practical things that you can watch out for as parents if you wonder if your child has autism or would like to know what you can do to support as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences in how autism presents, common signs of autism in girls, what some of the common co-occurring conditions are, the importance of getting some support early and where you can get some support from in Australia. So, general trends are that autism is often underdiagnosed in girls or diagnosed later than it is in boys. This could be due to the difference about how the symptoms present. And sometimes girls tend to mask their behaviours, which means that it's not as obvious as it is in boys, or the signs are a little bit more subtle. So when we talk about masked traits, girls might mimic other social behaviours and potentially do that a little bit better than the boys can. So, yeah, sometimes girls mimic behaviour, social actions of those around them. We tend to be pretty good at that. Sometimes they have intense interests that are more socially acceptable as well. The idea of that is that so for example, it might be animals or it might be books, it could even be crafting. And those intense interests don't seem to stand out as much as the boys who might have more stereotypical interests. What it means too is that sometimes, I forgot what I was going to say for a minute, but then it came back to me. Sometimes parents will say, oh, she just plays on her own all the time, like for hours. So parents can see that as a positive trait because girls can sit quiet and still and keep themselves busy for ages, but that may actually be a strong interest. The other thing is that girls might be struggling just as much with sensory overload and input as boys are, but they can hide it a bit better than boys can. So I guess that's potentially what is the message there, is maybe more masking and hiding of things than the boys. Advice for parents is to keep an eye out for subtle signs of these things, like maybe it's not that your daughter can't handle social interactions, maybe it's she's overwhelmingly tired or exhausted afterwards. Other things you might notice are emotional regulation difficulties, or maybe reliance on routine at times of stress and anxiety. So those things may look like positive coping strategies, but have a little look about what's underlying the strategies. Next is some of the common signs of autism in girls. The first one is social communication challenges, sensory sensitivities. So they are part of the diagnostic criteria. It's not different, but with the social but girls might just struggle in a bit more of a subtle way. So, in terms of social communication, girls might find it hard to read subtle social cues. They might have difficulty with group conversations or making and keeping friends. What you might find is that your daughter can make a friend, but maybe they only make one and have one solid friend that they do everything with or rely on for everything. Or it might mean that they can make friends and be friendly, but keeping the relationships is the bit that's tricky. Unlike boys, the communication difficulties can be more nuanced in girls as well. So it might mean that they do a lot of imitating the girls around them, or they learn the phrases that other girls use. So they might seem on the surface like they are doing things in a very similar way to their peers, but have a look at whether it's, used really organically, I guess, or whether it seems to be a standard response, and dig a bit deeper to see if it's because your daughter doesn't know what's happening or what she's meant to do, the expectations. The other area I wanted to mention was sensory sensitivities. Girls still will potentially have the same sensitivities or as boys, but sometimes they go unnoticed again because they're a bit better at hiding discomfort. So they might still have sensitivities to loud noises, certain textures, for example, but they may be a little bit better at hiding it. It feels really difficult to hear this stuff and talk about it because as a woman, I guess I can relate to the fact that we get a lot of messages as women about trying to be happy and not complain, and maybe that's filters down already. I mean, I know it does filter down already into quite young girls, but it's still not nice to think about them experiencing that. So what you can do is have a look for, observe your child during social interactions and maybe think about whether they seem overly quiet or withdrawn or whether they have difficulty navigating friendships. Another thing is too whether your child looks around to see what other kids do first before they choose what to do. That can be a sign that they're not feeling confident and comfortable and they're just following the crowd. Again, like when I talked about ADHD in girls, there are co-occurring conditions and sometimes cause misdiagnosis for autistic girls. Anxiety and depression is the most common one, and I want to talk about how that can sometimes happen at the same time, or sometimes it can be a misdiagnosis. Girls with autism often have really high levels of anxiety or sometimes depression as well, and that can be mistaken as the primary issue, which is where the misdiagnosis comes in. This, I guess, is maybe related to high levels of masking, but also that girls may have more of these, anxiety conditions than boys have. The difference is, I think, that girls often will become diagnosed with those things first. So, anxiety or OCD often before autism's considered. And that's probably because of the more subtle representation of those other difficulties like strong interests and sensory difficulties and social differences as well. So advice is for parents, if your daughter's been diagnosed with anxiety and particularly social anxiety as well, think about whether that social communication or sensory sensitivities could also be there and indicate autism. So having an early assessment by somebody or with somebody, if you're not sure, can be helpful because often we feel instinctively as parents we know what to do to support anxiety, and that's true. Well, it can be true, but you may feel confident there's nothing wrong with that, is what I'm trying to say. Except that potentially if you're not picking up those underlying difficulties and differences, that anxiety might be harder to treat because we're missing that understanding, that mismatch between your child and what the social expectations are that's causing the anxiety. So early identification and support is really important. That's because of the impact intervention can have. But another thing too is that understanding your child and meeting their needs earlier can prevent any other challenges from flowing on from the underlying difference. So with early intervention, early identification can mean you can get support like, you know, I don't know, whatever your child needs, whether it's help with managing emotions, whether it's help with social communication. So it might be through seeing a psychologist or an OT or a speech pathologist. And so it just means that you're getting a head start on putting in place the support that your child needs. Then, delaying that diagnosis can mean then that like I mentioned before, anxiety is developed, and then that makes it just that little bit harder to support your child because you've got to peel back the anxiety or not before, but before at the same time, you're peeling back the anxiety while you still have to work on that underlying core difference that's making life hard for your child. So my advice is to probably just trust your instincts. Seek some help if you notice some things that make you wonder about autism, even if they're subtle. In Australia, there are great resources like Yellow Ladybugs, an organisation for girls and I think maybe non-binary people with autism or autistic people. And there are pediatricians who can help with this stuff and psychologists, of course, like me. Parents often come to me and say that they are worried because their child's a girl that things will go unnoticed. I don't think there's ever a problem with saying that to somebody as well, if that's your fear and worry. I mean, I've worked with so many girls who are autistic and do assessments in that area, and so feel like I have a solid understanding of it. But when a parent says to me, look, some things are subtle and I worry it might be missed, then I'm going to take that on board and take a really thorough approach to make sure I always take a thorough approach and do a good assessment. But what I would do is really consider it from the parent's point of view. I always do that too, but I guess what I mean is there's no harm in saying it. And then having, it lets your psychologist know that you'd like them to walk it all through with you. And that's what I would do differently if parents ask about a particular concern they have about the assessment process. So, advocate for your child and for yourself. And if you feel like someone just doesn't quite get it, then, seek some help from somebody else as well. So where you can get some help in Australia, there are some great organisations. There are some support networks. So things like Yellow Ladybugs, like I mentioned, there's the Autistic Girls Network and an organisation called Amaze. These groups offer resources, they have support groups and advice tailored to girls on the spectrum. So there's lots of good information about that now. Yellow Ladybugs in particular, they've got a podcast and they have lots of books that you can use as resources. So yeah, lots of information about this available. But that's my advice around seeking help, is to reach out to these kind of organisations. You may need a formal diagnosis to be able to access support through NDIS, but otherwise you can still access support from psychologists. And without any need for NDIS and even Medicare. You can just come and see somebody and have some assessments to talk about these things, or then in some intervention as well, some support for your daughters in developing their social communication and other skills, so to work towards confidence and resilience. Important again to mention that working on social communication doesn't mean learning what other people do and teaching your autistic daughter to do that. It really means about them getting to know how they communicate, how others communicate, and then effectively communicating with people. So, in summary, there are some differences between boys and girls who are autistic, and unfortunately for girls, there is a bit more misdiagnosis or maybe later diagnosis. There could be more masking as well and looking around to follow what other people are doing that can lead to those difficulties not being understood as early as for boys. But the reason it is important is that the sooner you can help your daughter with whatever particular thing she's struggling with, or even if it's not that she's struggling, but just to understand who she is, the earlier you can help with that, the better. So hopefully this has opened your eyes to a little bit of that. Sounded condescending. I didn't mean that. But hopefully this is useful information, I guess is what I mean, to consider things for your daughter. Even if already diagnosed, you might use some of the advice for parents to watch how she does things in certain situations and how she copes with things, so that you can break down some of that masking with her to talk about what she really needs in the way of support from you and from people at school as well. So thanks so much for listening in again. So lovely to be able to share this stuff, and I really hope that it proves useful, and I will, see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Parent Like a Psychologist. If you found it helpful, please share on Instagram so other parents can benefit too, and tag me at Leanne Psychology so that I can say a big thank you. Head over to leannetran.com.au to join the village for bite-sized psychology tips straight to your inbox. I really hope this podcast has brought a new perspective and you a step closer towards a calm parent and a thriving child. Have a delightful day.